This is lab 4.1 GenAI, and in this lab we are going to use ChatGPT to try to predict direct labor hours for a company using construction starts. And we're going to use linear regression to forecast these direct labor hours. And the first thing I like to do is take a look at the data that I have. I've got 60 months worth of data, and I've got construction starts. I've got large multifamily units, small multifamily units, and single family units. And then I have the number of direct labor hours for this roofing company for each of these months. So let's open a new ChatGPT window. And let's upload that Excel spreadsheet I just showed you. And we're going to give ChatGPT some background information about this case, just explaining that we're working on Fiddler Roofing Company's data and what each variable means. Okay, so it looks like it understands the data that we've uploaded. The next thing we're going to do is ask ChatGPT to perform a regression analysis using the construction starts to estimate direct labor hours. Okay, and we've got some results here, and this looks right. Actually, ChatGPT is pretty good at regression analysis. Now, we are going to throw a little bit of a wrinkle in here, and I'm going to show you something that ChatGPT is not always as good at. What we are going to do is use a little bit of intuition as the business owner here, or just common logic. We are trying to predict the number of direct labor hours we need for roofing, but when we start building a home or an apartment building, we don't put the roof on first. And so it could be that if we are trying to predict direct labor hours, it makes more sense to use last month's construction starts to predict this month's direct labor hours. In other words, we think that a month in, now we need some direct labor hours to start putting that roof on. And so in ChatGPT, we are going to ask it to regress next month's direct labor hours on current month construction starts. And we're going to rerun that regression. And so what it's doing is it's lagging that variable. If you look at our original data, it is going to shift those direct labor hours up a month so that February hours are in the same row as January construction starts. And I have to tell you, you got to be very careful here, because if it doesn't shift those variables correctly, you won't get the correct output. But in this case, it looks like it's done a good job. So let's ask ChatGPT which regression is better based on the output. Are direct labor hours better predicted by current starts or previous starts? And short answer, previous month's construction starts predict direct labor hours better, which is what we expect based on what we know about when we put a roof on a building. So given that that's the better month, let's ask additional questions about that second regression. Let's figure out which variables are significant and insignificant. And the results say that large multifamily structures and single-family homes are significant, but small multifamily units are not. And that's based on a p-value of 0.05, which is pretty standard. So given that we've got two significant variables and one that's not, let's rerun that regression analysis, but take out that insignificant variable. Let's only use the large multifamily units and the single-family units. Okay, and it's coming up with a result here. And be very careful here. I've run this several times incorrectly, but let's check these results. I'm getting an intercept of 3349, and we've got a coefficient on our large units at 6.17 and 5.03 for our single-family units, which actually is what I get when I run this in Excel. But be careful, you may get a different answer here, because it's a bit of a black box what ChatGPT is doing, unless you ask it specific questions about how it's coming up with its results. Just know that if they shift any of those variables incorrectly, you're going to get different answers here. So now that we're happy with our regression analysis, let's try to predict next month's direct labor hours, assuming that we have 1,000 large multifamily construction starts and 1,500 single-family construction starts this month. So it's essentially plugging these two variables into the model that we've created. And you should get 17,072. So that is the correct answer. Okay, now ultimately what we're trying to figure out is not just direct labor hours, but we're trying to figure out staffing needs and how many people we need to hire. So let's assume that an average roofer works 45-hour weeks. Based on this information, how many roofers will I need next month? Okay, so we get 94.84 or 85 workers, and ChatGPT is 100% right. You can't hire a fraction of a roofer, so we're going to round up to 95 roofers. All right, well, let's get a couple of files that we can save for our future analysis. First, let's get the most recent regression results in a table form. I'd love putting it in a PNG file, but for now, let's just output it right here to our window. And this should match the results we already have, but we've got more detail here, t-stat, p-values, and we also have some model statistics. And I've got a slight difference on this f-stat, but this is all very, very close. All right, the last thing we want to get from ChatGPT today is a scatter plot with predicted direct labor hours on the x-axis and actual direct labor hours on the y-axis. And then we can see how good our model is at predicting direct labor hours based on the data we've provided. In other words, if we can see that the estimate of direct labor hours is very close to the actual direct labor hours, this is a good model. Now, one thing this particular picture isn't giving us is kind of a line that shows us that prediction. So let's just add that in. You add a line that shows us or helps us see how far each estimate is from the actual direct labor hours. And I like this graph a little bit better, although they didn't put an actual line in on the diagonal. This does give us a line from each prediction to the estimate, which is going to be right on this diagonal. So that's a helpful visualization for us. Okay, so we see that ChatGPT and other GenAI programs are pretty good at this basic type of analysis, although we do have to be careful when we are using lags or moving things around to make sure that we understand what's going on in the black box that is this GenAI program, to make sure that the output is correct.